Hi, I'm Cassie from MeTime. This is a tutorial for the Perfectly Pieced 2023 Sampler Quilt, featuring all 12 of the first year's blocks. Today we are going to share with you the steps you'll need to make this quilt at home. These steps will also be available separately in some mini tutorials, so you can watch the step you need when you need it. Today we'll talk about how to quilt sashing, borders, and the cornerstones, also known as filler blocks, how to sew perfectly pieced blocks together to make a 4-patch, how to stitch the sashing, filler blocks, and the 4-patch blocks together in a row, and how to measure the borders and attach them to the quilt, how to prepare the back fabric, create a quilt sandwich, and stitch in the ditch. We'll also learn how to cut binding, not on the bias, how to miter the fabric together, attach the binding onto the quilt, and then how to hand bind. It has been such a fun year making different and unique blocks with all of you and our Perfectly Pieced program with MeTime delivered. To celebrate, we thought it would be a good idea to make a full quilt showing off all of the blocks and to make this quilt using a bunch, but not all, of the fabric from your boxes. In fact, you might find that there is enough scraps left over to make the 4-patch blocks from your boxes. But if not, feel free to mix and match any fabrics of your choice. Okay, before we go too deep into the tutorial, I have to show you the quilt. I have part of it done so far, but don't worry, I'm going to do all of the important parts that you need to know to put your own quilt together today. Some of these blocks might look very familiar, especially if you've been with us this past year. They're all of the blocks from this last year of Perfectly Pieced. They might look a little bit different just because they're in different fabrics. This one, for example, right here, is in very different fabrics. We're used to seeing it like this back here on the board. Isn't that cool? You can mix and match and make them your own, which is the best part about Perfectly Pieced. We're giving you a block that then you can take and make into all sorts of different things. So let's get started. Okay, before we get too involved, we're going to talk about some of the things that you might need to help you make your quilt. So the first thing is one of these clappers. It helps us make our seams nice and straight and even, and we're going to be using this today. Some other things that you might need is your Perfectly Pieced General Resource Guide. The nice thing is this comes down with your download every single month. And if you want a nice paper copy, we have that in the store as well. This teaches you how to bind and so many other things that are important for making your quilt. Other things that we're going to need is our ultralight mesh cutaway stabilizer and our batting. These help us make all of our blocks and do our embroidery, and they're important for our quilt. A couple other things that you might need are some slap bands. I know that seems sort of strange, but when you start making a bigger quilt and we're doing stitching in the ditch, these are going to help hold our quilt in place and out of our way, and I'll show you how to use those today. Along the way, I'll also be using a bunch of other little different things that I find very helpful for making a quilt, and I hope you will too. The final thing that I'd like to talk about before we get stitching is the fabric. So you'll notice that we spent a lot of time figuring out the fabric for this quilt because we couldn't use all of the fabric. Not all of the fabric goes together, but I want to talk to you a little bit about what goes together and how to figure out what fabric to do for your quilt. I'm just going to fan these out, and you'll recognize them since they come from your Perfectly Pieced boxes from this last year. And I want you to see these because they all have a very similar tone and feel to them. We chose these because we wanted them to have small prints, not to be too bold, and we wanted to have a really nice, clean look. Now, if you look at these, they all have that feel, but if I bring something in that's a little bit brighter, it kind of throws off my balance, so I wouldn't want to put this one in my quilt. The pattern's a little bit too bright for my other choices and a little bit too big. I'm going to grab another one. This one right here is a fantastic fabric, but it didn't quite work in this quilt, again, because it doesn't have kind of that dusty tone, and the pattern was a little bit too big for a sampler quilt. So that one wasn't going to be one I'd choose. And even this one, this is a really bright yellow. It is gorgeous, but not quite right for this quilt. So we realize here at MeTime that sometimes it's hard to figure out your quilt, and figuring out fabrics is a little bit tricky sometimes. So one of the best things we did is in your instructions, we have a coloring page. So you can print it out and spend time coloring, figuring out where you want your fabrics to go, and making sure that you have the balance that you're looking for. Okay, let's talk about the sashing and the cornerstones, also known as the filler blocks. I'm going to take a little 4 patch, and what we're going to do is we're going to put the sashing all the way around this to kind of give it a frame. And then to kind of break up that frame and give it some interest, we're going to put these little cornerstones on each of the corners to give us that kind of fun look with the little square in the corner and the sashing on all of the sides. Right now I'm going to show you how to quilt those. So I'm going to move the ones that I already have quilted to the side, and we're going to hoop our ultralight mesh cutaway stabilizer. So we're just going to put our hoop down, and we're going to measure our stabilizer and just cut above. And we can set that aside for a moment. And then we're going to loosen our hoop. We're going to take out that center piece and our stabilizer. We'll put that there in the center, and we'll give it a little bit of a push to make sure that that stabilizer sits good. And then we're going to tighten it up. We don't want to tighten it up too far that it is too tight and can hurt the hoop, but we want to do it just to finger tight. Then I like to go through and just kind of adjust my stabilizer and make sure that I don't see any bubbling going on there. Okay, now that I have hooped my stabilizer and placed it into my machine, I'm going to go ahead and stitch this sashing with the block by block method. Right now I have a dark colored thread in my machine. That's just for video purposes. At home, go ahead and use a neutral colored thread. Okay, so what we just did is we stitched the placement line for our batting, and that is there so that we know exactly where to put our batting. We're going to place it completely covering that placement line, and then we're going to tape it in place. So we tape it in place while it's in the machine. It won't move or wiggle on us or go someplace that we don't want it to. So we want to make sure that it's smooth and taped nicely. Then we're going to return it to the machine for the tack down line. All right, okay, so now that we have tacked down our batting, we're going to take our scissors and we're going to trim all the way around that tack down line. So we'll just take them and we'll lift up the tape. We're going to cut just straight across here, and you want to be close to the stitch line, but you don't have to be exactly perfect. And we're going to get rid of all of that excess. Okay, we'll get rid of that tape as well. And you have a little bit left here, and that's okay. We're going to take our next side. I like to lift it up so that it's nice and taut, and then cut close. Rotate. We always cut on the same side. So if you're right-handed, stay over here on the right, and if you're left-handed, on the left. We don't want to cut around in a funny angle. So we're going to go ahead and lift and cut. And then we're going to rotate our hoops so that we're cutting on the same side again. And then we're going to cut. All right, now that we have that all cut, we're going to return it back to the machine, and it's going to stitch the placement line for our fabric. So the nice thing about this block by block method is we don't have to guess where to put our fabric. We know exactly where to place it because of these placement lines. So I'm going to take my fabric, I'm going to give it a quick little starch because I want it to lay really flat, and I'm going to iron it just off screen here for a second so it looks really good. Alright, now that we have starched and pressed our fabric, we're going to lay that on our batting, making sure that we're covering the placement line on both sides. And then we're going to take our tape and we're going to put some on the top, and then we're going to smooth our fabric down and put it on the bottom. And we're taping to keep everything nice and straight. Okay, and then we're going to put it back in our machine, and we're going to do the tack down line for the sashing. So one quick thing to note about these two lines that we just stitched is they're going to be sewn into the seam, and so you normally will not see them. Occasionally they might pick out, but that's something that you can take off later once you have put your pieces into your quilt. So we're going to put this back in the machine and we're going to quilt our beautiful sashing design. All right, I love to watch the quilting. It's so mesmerizing and relaxing. But after we have all of that quilted, we simply remove it from the hoop. And then we can remove the tape and cut away our excess stabilizer. And it can just wait until we're ready for it. Now I know some of you might ask, but what if my sashing is longer? Well, we're going to show you how to do multi-hoopings when we do the borders, so don't worry, that's coming. You can cut with a pair of scissors, or you can use your rotary cutter, whichever you prefer. I'm going to stand because I always cut better if I do, but I'm going to line that up and cut away all the excess stabilizer. We're going to cut it on both the top and the bottom sides because we don't need that hanging out here. Okay, and after we're done cutting it out, it can set to the side until we're ready for it. So now that we have finished stitching all of our sashing, we're going to show you how to stitch the cornerstones for this quilt, which is also how you would stitch a filler block. I have light mesh cutaway stabilizer already hooped in a smaller hoop. I'm going to just slide that into my machine. And what we're using is the Perfectly Pieced October 2-inch block design. And what we're going to do is just skip all of the stitches in the middle where we do all the piecing of the fabric and use the quilting to give us that beautiful design. So we're going to start with stitching the placement line for the batting. Alright, for video purposes, I am using a 5x7 hoop. However, at home you go ahead and use a 4x4 hoop if you would like. I just want to make sure you have plenty of room to see what we're doing here. As well, I've stitched this placement line in a dark colored thread, and you can use a neutral colored thread when you're at home. So we're going to take this little 2-inch block size placement line and place our batting, completely covering it, and we're going to tape it in place. We do this so that it doesn't move or shift on us while it's in the embroidery machine. And then we'll put it into the embroidery machine and stitch the tack down line. Okay, and then similar story. We're going to take our scissors and we're going to lift up on that batting, and we're going to cut nice and close to that stitch line without clipping any of the stitches. Rotate, keeping our hand on the same side. As we cut nice and close, rotate, and then cut nice and close again. We do our final side, and then we're going to be ready to put it back into the machine. Okay, so once we have cut away all of our excess batting and put it back in our machine, we're going to do a little bit of skipping. So the next step is machine step 3, and we're going to skip past all of the perfectly pieced piecing fabric steps and get to where we do that final outline stitch. So I'm going to just skip ahead. And for this particular design with the October 2-inch block for Perfectly Pieced, we're going to go all the way to step 14. And we're going to do that final outline stitch, and this is going to be our placement line for our fabric. I'm going to quick switch out my thread, and then we will place our fabric. Okay, so now that we have stitched that outline stitch here, which was step 14 for this design, we're going to take our already starched and pressed filler block fabric and we're going to try and center it best we can. So we want to make sure we have about the same amount of fabric on the top and the bottom and the sides, so it's pretty even. Then we're going to take our tape and we're going to tape it to keep things straight. and then we're going to return it to the machine. Okay, so once we have our filler block all taped in place, we're going to put it into our machine and we're going to repeat that same step that we just did where we had that outline stitch so it can tack our block down. That is because it gives us that final outline stitch which we need to cut the block to the correct size. So we're going to do that and then go ahead and do the quilting. Okay, so now after everything's been quilted, you can remove the hoop from the machine and we have a perfect block. You see right here, this is our cutting and trimming line and then our cute quilting there so it can go inside our quilt. I'm just going to remove it from the hoop and then we can cut it out and set it aside until we're ready to put it inside our quilt. You can do this with a rotary cutter or a pair of scissors. Since we did our last sashing with the rotary cutter, I'm going to show you scissors. So this one is the same concept. You're cutting either directly on those stitches or just to the side of them. So if you clip some of these, that's fine. You want to be as close to this stitch line as possible. Go ahead and just rotate your block as you are cutting and make sure that you cut about as even as possible. So either way will work. If you have a rotary cutter and you like to do it that way, or if you'd prefer a pair of scissors, it works out both ways. Alright, so if you'll notice on the big quilt we have these amazing 4-inch borders around the whole thing and they look just like this, but it's really long. So we're going to show you how to do multiple hoopings for a border. This also applies for sashing. So I'm excited to share that with you. What we need is one long piece of fabric, which is our border fabric, cut to the right size, and then you're going to have a handful of little pieces of batting. And these are cut to the size of your embroidery file. So I'm using a 2x10 today for this demonstration, and we're going to have those cut, I'll show you, so that they measure 11. So what I want them to be is just a little bit bigger than my embroidery file. And then instead of 4, because that's what I'm finishing on, I have this at 4.5. So that's the size of my batting. We're going to hoop our light mesh cutaway stabilizer or ultra light, either one works. And we're going to load this into the machine. And I have put that dark thread in again for video purposes, just so you can see the placement lines, but we'll switch that later when we get to the quilting. So we'll go ahead and stitch the placement line for our first batting. And same story, just like all of the other block by block methods here, we're going to take our batting and place it completely covering that placement line. And then we're going to use our tape to keep it straight. Just put a piece here and then smooth it and put a piece here on the bottom. And then where this is a little bit of a longer piece, I'm going to put one on each side. And that is just to keep it from shifting while it's in the embroidery machine. And then we can stitch the tack down line. Now remember at home to use your neutral color thread, but right now you can clearly see these tack down lines, so you know what we've tacked down. After that, we're going to take our scissors and we're going to trim away the excess batting. And we're just going to cut close to the stitch line, but not clip any of the stitches. Alright, after you have finished cutting out all of the excess batting, we're going to return it to the machine and we're going to stitch the placement line for the fabric. So what you can see right here is that placement line for your fabric. So I'm going to set that aside for just a moment and I'm going to switch out my thread so that we can have the right color for our quilting. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to take our long piece of fabric here for our border and we're going to make sure that we can line it up at the top, keeping all the sides and everything just inside that box. And what we're going for is about the same amount of fabric on either side here, up here and down here. So I can feel it's not quite right, so I'm going to just gently move my fabric to make sure that it feels more even. All right. Then I'm going to tape this in place here. And I'm actually going to take some tape and I'm going to roll it into a little mini roll. And I'm going to lift up the fabric on this end and I'm going to stick it right there. And then I'm going to take my fabric and smooth it and then press down on that little rolled piece of tape. And the rest of this is a really long train of fabric. We're going to roll up and we're going to clip it out of our way. So I'm just going to take it and kind of spiral it into a little bit of a cinnamon roll there. Then I'm going to take my favorite sewing clips and I'm just going to clip it so that it doesn't move on me or get in my way. All right, now we're going to put it in the machine. And we're going to stitch that tack down line for the fabric. Okay, now that it has stitched both of those tack down lines, we're going to let it stitch the beautiful quilting here in the center. Okay, I'm going to take out this beautiful quilting. Oh, it's just gorgeous. I absolutely love how it feels like the kind of quilting that can go with anything. And the really exciting thing is this is not a quilting that you have received before. The rest of the quiltings are everything that you get for your blocks and the sashing and the cornerstones you've already received this past year, but this one is brand new. We're so excited to share it with you. So now that we've done the first piece, we have to show you how to hoop the next one. You ready? Let's do it. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is remove all of those sewing clips and just set them aside for a moment. And then we're going to unhoop our stabilizer and we're going to set that aside for a second. And I'm going to measure and cut another piece of stabilizer because we're going to need that for our second hooping. Just going to cut that. And then I'm going to hoop this just as we do all of our regular hooping. Tighten it up and then remove any bubbles. All right, and I'm going to set that over here in our machine just for a moment while we cut out this border. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lift it up and pull off that rolled piece of tape. I'm going to save it for later because I can reuse it. And I'm going to do the same thing with this one. But this time I'm going to take this tape and I'm going to roll it because I'm going to need 2 rolled pieces for this next part. All right, and then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut it really close right here against that batting. And then I'm going to get rid of this excess stabilizer because I don't need it. So the thing is to make sure that you don't cut any of your fabric. So go ahead and kind of move the fabric aside and cut away that stabilizer. If you feel more comfortable using a rotary cutter, you are welcome to do that as well. I'm going to move it and just cut that away. Then the last side, again, I'm angling it just so I don't cut that fabric. Okay, now it's free. So we're going to move quickly to our machine and we're going to repeat the same process. We're going to stitch that tack down line and the batting and everything, and then I'll show you what we do next. All right, same story. We're going to take our batting, put it over that placement line. Nothing changes on this part for the second hooping, which is really nice. And we're going to tape that in place so that it stays straight. Smooth it and tape that again. And then we're going to put it back in the machine for the tack down line. Okay, same story as before. We're going to take our scissors and we're going to trim all the way around our batting. So now we're going to return it back to the hoop and do the tack down line for the fabric. So the good news is prepping the rest of the hoopings is exactly the same. You put your placement line, your batting, you trim, you tack it down, and then you do your placement line for your fabric, and that never changes. This is the fun part though. So we're going to rotate our hoop so that it is vertical next to us. And we're going to take our project and we're going to flip it upside down so they're both sitting here side by side. Then we're going to take our tape. We have our 2 rolled pieces. We're going to stick one up above and we're going to take the next one and stick it down below. And then what we're going to pay attention to is this edge right here with the batting. We want to make sure that this cut edge and this one and the one here that's horizontal all line up together. So I'm going to pull this so you can see it. We're going to let the rest of the fabric kind of hang out. And we're going to put this right here. And what we're looking for is that all of that batting lines up perfectly. Then I like to unfold it, give it a little bit of a stick, and then do a double check. The worst thing is you don't double check. So I'm again checking that my batting lines up really nicely, and it does. So then I'm going to pull my fabric down and smooth it, making sure that both my left and right sides are aligning and that they are feeling about even. And then once I get here, down to the end, I'm going to push it against that piece of tape. Make sure it's nice and stuck. Okay. Then I will take my tail and I will clip that in place so it's out of the way. And because I have fabric above and I have fabric below, I want to make sure that I tape these sides so that nothing moves and wiggles on me. It's all about keeping stuff straight here. So then we're going to gently take this and put it back into the machine. And again, just double check everything. If you need to double push that tape there or here, make sure that it's sticking where you need it, and then you can go ahead and stitch the tack down lines. And since everything's already in place, all we have to do is press go and it can quilt the pretty design. And with that, we're done with our double hooping. So at this point, you would just continue on hooping as many times as you need to finish quilting that entire border. For more information about quilting borders, you can check out your Perfectly Pieced General Resource Guide. They have step-by-step instructions on how to do it there as well. So you have it either way here on video or in your General Resource Guide. Now we're ready to talk about piecing our blocks together. So Perfectly Pieced has a really cool thing with their blocks. It's called the anatomy of the block. If you grab your General Resource Guide and turn to the front of it, there is a diagram right here that shows you the anatomy of the block. And this is important for stitching your blocks together because there are 3 lines. This inner line right here is the batting tack down line, and that just shows you where the batting is stitched. The line just outside of it, this line right here, is our stitching line, and we're going to sew directly on that line to get our perfect 4-inch seams. And then this line right here on the outside, that is our cut line, and that's what's done at the very end of our stitching right before we quilt, and you go all the way around the block, and that's what we cut on directly. Alright, so now that we've learned about the block, we're going to make a 4-square. So this is what a 4-square is. It's where we put 4 blocks together, and you can call it a 4-square or a 4-patch. Either of those are regularly known terms. and we're going to do that together. So I'm going to move this one aside since that one's already sewn, and I'm going to take my blocks. So this is my little blocks that I have already stitched. These are 4-inch blocks, and I'm going to arrange them or tumble them however I want, which is a nice thing. You can get different looks however you tumble them. This is the look that we're going to do for this quilt. Isn't that cute? I'm so excited. Now there's some things that you need to know about lining up. Our quilting is continuous. If you can kind of look here, it might be hard to see, the quilting goes across and it matches the blocks. So when we are putting them together, we're going to match not only where the fabric goes, but where the quilting hits as well. So I'm going to take 2 blocks and I'm going to put them right sides together. And because they should be cut about right, I'm just going to kind of tap them and make them even as much as I can. And then I'm going to just kind of make any adjustments that I think need done. Then I'll take my sewing clips and I'll clip a little bit excessively. You don't normally need this many when you're sewing, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to check my block before I stitch it. So, seems like quite a lot, but that's okay. Then I can open it kind of like a book and I can look and see, okay, my quilting is lining up here, it's lining up there, it's lining up there, and my fabric is lining up. All right, so I'm good. I'm gonna go ahead and stitch this first line. So I'm gonna scooch over here to my sewing machine, and I'm gonna be sewing directly on that sewing line, which is a little bit light for you because it was done in a light colored thread, but I'm going to watch it carefully. I'm gonna remove that top clip so I have room for my presser foot, and I will put it down and stitch this stitch. You just go ahead and remove your clips as you go. Okay. Now, blocks are perfect, but I am not, and so I'm going to double check that that's stitched okay. So I just open it back up, and I decide whether or not I like how everything lined up. If you don't like how it lines up, it's okay. It's just easy to unpick and adjust and go ahead and sew it again. So we're going to take our iron and we're going to open up that seam. Everybody calls it different things. I call it butterflying the seam, but what we're going to do is open it up nice and flat, and after we get it all warmed up, we're going to take our wood clapper and we're going to put it right on top, and we're going to press, and we're going to wait until it cools down. That's going to help our seam lay nice and flat. Okay, after you like your seam, you go ahead and set that aside, and we're going to sew the next half. So same story as before. Line it up how we'd like. Make sure that we're on that stitch line. And then we're going to sew along, removing the clips as we sew. And then we'll double check this side. We like how it looks, then we're going to iron it. Open up or butterfly your seam. Go ahead and warm it up, pressing really nice. And then with your clapper, we're gonna make that seam stay nice and flat. And this is just gonna help us when we're stitching the next seam to make our 4-patch. Okay, so now that I have these pieces, I don't want to put them this way, though you could. That'd be a really fun pattern. You get a really cool triangle there. But I'm going to turn them around and get this pattern. So, same story as before. We can line up all of our seams, but the most important part here is lining the center seam and then the edges. So, I like to start there. Again, I'm going to kind of tap my blocks and make sure that I have those two lined up best I can. And I like to put a sewing clip on either side, just directly, so that that's really where I want it to go. And then I'm going to kind of smooth my fabric and add a couple sewing clips on either side. And then again, I'm going to open it just like a book, and I'm going to check to see if I think things are lining up. If it looks pretty good, then I'm going to go ahead and stitch it, but if I see something off, like this one's slightly off, I'm going to unclip and see if I can adjust it just a little bit to improve how it's going to look. So this, I'll come and look at my stitching and I'll say, okay, you need to go right there, and I've got it where I want it, so then I'm going to clip it right where I pinched it. And I'm going to look at this quilting here. I want that to line up right there, so then I'm going to clip it right there so that my stitching for the quilting is lining up correctly. All right, let's give this a go. Now the nice thing is it doesn't matter if you have it this way or this way, both sides have that stitching line. So we're gonna put it in our machine and get it right on that 1/4 inch seam line and give it a stitch. And I just remove clips as I go. When I get to that center seam line, I'm going to kind of hold it a little bit harder with my finger over here so that it doesn't move. And then I'm going to carry on and finish the seam. I like to scooch this one just to hold my corner when I get to longer seams like this so that it doesn't move when I'm almost there. And then I just remove that one at the end. All right. Now we get to open it and see how we did. Pretty good. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. I want a really perfect X where everything lines up and my seams are just beautiful. So since I like it, we're gonna go ahead and put it over here and we're going to warm up that seam. We're gonna butterfly it open and we're gonna press it. Give it a little bit of an extra pressure right there in the center and then continue opening it up. And then because I want that to stay, I'm going to take my clapper and I'm going to hold it there just until it cools down. Okay, now that everything is all aligned and sewn, I have this beautiful 4-patch with Perfectly Pieced. All right, now that you have some 4 patches, we're going to show you how to stitch your rows together. The first thing we're going to do is gather our other 4 patches that are in our row. So these are my 3 that I'm going to put together in this quilt for this demonstration. And then I'm going to take our sashing, which we already quilted, and I'm going to place them where they're going to go. So we're going to stitch them just like this. So you're going to take your block and you're going to set it here, and you're going to take your sashing and you're going to put them right sides together. And what we're going to do is line up that sashing as best we can, remembering that you're going to have a 1/4 inch over here that's going to go in a seam and a 1/4 inch over here. So when you're lining up your batting, you're going to want that about a 1/4 inch away from each side so that you end up with this batting right where you need it. So once you have everything situated the way you want it, you're going to take your sewing clips and you're just going to clip that border on. You can use as many as you wish or as few as you wish. It doesn't matter. You can use whatever you like as long as you feel comfortable sewing that seam. And then we're going to take this and I'm going to flip it to this side. Reason why is I know my blocks have that 1/4 inch seam line already in the anatomy, and so I can stitch directly on that line and I don't have to kind of guess on my 1/4 inch seam. So we're going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch it. We'll just line it right up. Okay, and what you'll notice straight off is that my border isn't the exact length that I need for my blocks. So at this point, I can go ahead and just trim it so that they're the same size because I already spent the time making sure I had it centered. So I'm just going to give it a teeny little clip, just like that. All right, and then I can take it over here and I'm going to iron it. There's a lot of ironing when you're sewing a quilt together. We want to make sure that all of our seams are laying nice and flat. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to just kind of move apart all the different threads and fabric pieces so I can get it nice and flat. And then after I have it all open and warmed up, we're gonna put the clapper on and we're gonna just hold it until it cools. Okay, now that I have that one ready, I need to move to the next block. Now everything should be exactly where I need it and the exact same size. But if you want to double check both sides, you can always clip the length after you get this next block on. So I'm going to line it up, massage the fabric into place so we don't have excess in the seams. And then we can go ahead and clip it, and we can sew this line as well. Same story as before. And then we'll take it over here and we'll iron it. And that's kind of the continuous pattern. It's to sew a seam and then iron it flat. And after it's all warmed up, then we're going to use our favorite clapper and make sure that seam stays nice and flat. So after you get your seam nice and flat, go ahead and flip it over and make sure you like what you see. If you do, then go ahead and grab the next sashing and line it up. Now this one wasn't sewn yet like the last one, so we're going to do what we did in the first one. And we're going to line it up and make sure that we have this about where our 1/4 inch seams are going to be. That way we avoid getting the batting in our seams. Once we like where it is, we're going to clip it in place. Okay, then bring it over to our sewing machine and stitch our line. Then I'm going to iron it. It's starting to get bigger, and that's okay. Press a little bit on that center seam if you can feel it humping a little bit, and then help it cool down. The nice thing about the wood is it kind of absorbs that heat, and if you're using moisture, it does that a little bit too. And then after we have it where we want it, it feels a lot cooler, we're to our last block. Now last time I trimmed it here, I'm going to show you what it looks like if you decide that you want to put the next one on before you trim it. So that way you can see it both ways, either is fine. So we're going to turn our quilt that way. Without trimming it, you do have to spend a little bit of more time kind of lining up your blocks, which is kind of nice about trimming it, is that way you don't have to worry about lining it up because it already is. Okay, but I want you to see both ways. So now that I have it where I want it, I'm going to clip it and do the same thing. We're going to open up our seam. Take our iron and do the same thing we did with all the rest of them. Make sure that we heat that up nice in the center. And then we're going to trade our iron for our wood clapper and hold it tight. Give it a chance to cool. And then since we didn't trim it beforehand, if you want this method instead, now is when we're going to trim it. So we're going to just take our scissors and cut off that excess, twirl it around, and do that here. So you can choose whichever way you prefer, but now you know how you can use both methods. Ta-da! All right, now that we have this whole row done with the sashing in between and on the ends of the blocks, we're going to do a row of sashing and the cornerstones here on the bottom. And it's going to be the bottom of the quilt, so we're excited to do that. So I have here a bunch of cornerstones, also known as filler blocks, and the sashing. So we're going to use our little sashing pieces kind of as a guide to make sure that they're going to match up with the blocks. The reason we want to do this is once we have it sewn on, we want to have beautiful, perfect corners right here. So I'm going to set this on top, and I'm going to measure and see kind of where I'm at and make sure I know how much extra fabric I have. So I'm going to pull this a little to the center so you can see. This one I have a little bit more fabric than I do over here. So that tells me that if I just sewed the cornerstone on, I would have this off center. And I don't want that. So I'm going to use my batting as my guide on here, and I'm going to actually measure and cut a 1/4 inch on here. I'm going to just scooch that for a minute because we don't need it at the moment. I'm going to take my water-soluble marker and my ruler that shows me that 1/4 inch. And I'm going to set it right against that batting, right here. And I'm going to draw my line, because I need a 1/4 inch seam, right? I'm going to swing this around and do the same thing on this side. My batting was correct when I measured it, so I know I need a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so now that I have that marked, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut right on that line I just drew on both sides so that I've got rid of all the excess fabric. You can keep that in your quilt if you want, but I like to get rid of it because it helps me line everything up better. So then I can take my cornerstone, and I know I want it to face this direction. So I want to put it like this, line it up, and then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch it. Okay, so then we're going to take it out. I'm going to trim some of those excess threads because we don't want them hanging out everywhere. Bring it back over here and we're going to iron it just like we did with all of the other sashing. We want to make sure that all of our seams are laying as flat as possible. We'll put our clapper on and cool it down, making sure it's nice and flat. And then we're going to do the other cornerstone on the opposite side. So I always double check. That's the direction I want it. Okay, I want it that direction. So I'm going to put it on just like that. Make sure that I clip it. Now this one has a little bit of excess stabilizer, so I'm going to make sure that that stays above my fabric line. We're going to clip it here and here, and then take it to our machine. And again, I know that this is a perfect 1/4 inch seam. I just measured it. So I'm going to slip it in and stitch right against that batting line. All right. We're going to iron it, and then we're going to re-look at our block and make sure that we have it lined up as best as possible. Cool that down. Once it feels a lot cooler, then I can check it. Okay, that looks like it's going to line up pretty good once it's in the seams. So then I'm going to carry on and do the same thing with the next one. Okay, so we're going to show you how to do the next one again. Now this one is going to match up with this block, so I want to make sure that it's going to line up okay. Looks like it will, so I'm going to go and I'm going to measure my 1/4 inch seam. Again, the batting is matching up with the batting, so I'm going to take my marker, I'm going to mark that, flip it over, line my 1/4 inch with that batting, and mark that one. Trim off the extra. Again, you can leave it in your quilt if you'd like to, but I like to have less bulk. So I'm going to get rid of it. Alright. Now, the fun thing is I already have one of these on here, and so I get to put this one right here next to it and not worry about doing it separately. So we're making a long strip right now with these. and stitch our seam line. And then same story, we're gonna give it an iron. Open up that seam, press it really good, and then put that clapper on there so we can cool it down and get it laying flat. All right, and then we can double check it. Are we lining up the way we want to? So far, so good. So we can stitch the next cornerstone on and finish this strip. Okay, after you have your last row of sashing and the cornerstones all sewn together, we're going to take our row above and this row, and we're going to flip the sashing row upside down and line up all of our seams with all of our sewing clips. Now, it is okay to use as many clips as you want, or pins if you prefer. Just throw them all in there. It's all about getting everything to line up as perfectly as you can. So I'm going to take my sewing clips and I'm going to clip away and make it look all nice and straight and lined up as best to my ability, and then we'll sew it. So one thing I like to do when I am lining up all of my seams is I start with lining up the cornerstones. And I make sure that I have a clip or two on either side so that I get those seam lines exactly where I want them. And then I'll go back and add clips in the middle. So I'll get those to where I want them and then come back in and just clip those so that they lay where I want them to. All right, after we have everything all clipped in place, we're going to take our strips here and we're going to put it right here into the sewing machine, and we're going to make sure we stitch with the 1/4 inch seam allowance and stitch this on. All right, now that we have that long strip sewn, we are going to take our iron, and just like before, we're going to iron it nice and then with our clapper cool down the seams. This is very important so that we don't have bulk and we have everything laying really nice and flat. Because it's a really long section, you do have to do this in tiny pieces. So we're going to just iron that and then move it along down on our mat and then do the next bit. The good news is, after we have this ironed, then we can put this piece with the rest of the quilt. Okay, so what I just finished with you is sewing that bottom row. Now this is going to need to be joined to the rest of the quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and grab it, and we're going to unfold it. And then we're going to do what we just did with the last row, is we're going to line everything up. I think I'll just twist it this way so that we can attach it. And we're going to use as many clips or pins as we feel necessary. And we're going to just flip those right sides together. Then I'll twirl it around and I'll begin clipping it all in place. And we just line up those seams. It helps to line up those cornerstones and then everything in between. Okay, now that this is a bigger piece, you are welcome to spread it out if you have room, or if you don't have a ton of space, you can just lightly roll the quilt and let it kind of hang out over here. If you need a little bit more security that it's not going to go anywhere, you can always take your slap band and just let it kind of cup that quilt. And then come over here and you can let it cup the quilt that way too, so then it just kind of keeps it there and then it's not going to roll away and go anywhere. All right, I'm going to stitch this line and then we'll see how this looks. Okay, after we have an entire quilt top ready to get the borders put on, we're going to spread it out in front of us. And because of difference of seam lines and things shifting, moving, we can't just guarantee that the borders that we cut are going to fit perfectly. So we're going to take a measuring tape. We're going to set that border aside for a second. And we're going to measure through the center. We're going to start here at the top. measure down, and see where we land. And so I'm at about 42 and a half. So I'm going to cut these borders to 42 and a half for the two long sides. We're going to leave the shorter sides till after we get these borders attached. We're going to pin or clip them on and then sew a nice stitch. All right, now that we have everything measured and cut to size, we're going to put it into the machine and we're going to stitch everything at a 1/4 inch seam. So I will take the quilt and I'm just going to lightly fold it and twist it over so that I can keep it mostly out of my way. And then I'm just going to set it under here and stitch away. So when you're stitching a quilt that's bigger, it is important to keep moving it along with you so that you don't have a drag going on, because then you're going to stitch kind of at funny angles. So as you're stitching, make sure you keep shifting the quilt forward. Alright, after you're finished stitching all of your seams, remember to open them all up and press them good. Use your clapper to make sure that you let the seams cool down so that they can be nice and flat and beautiful. So I'm going to take care of that and then we'll be right back to do the top borders. So what we've just done is we've sewn both of the side borders on the long edges of the quilt. And because those are sewn on, we need to measure again. So we're going to take our measuring tape and we're going to put it on the side here and then measure all the way across. So I'm at about 39 1/4. So that's what I'm going to want to cut my top and bottom borders to, and then I can stitch those on. So now that we have everything clipped in place, we're going to stick it in the machine and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you get one side done, we're going to just twist and flip to the other. And you can just fold up the one end so that it doesn't hang out too far, and then just adjust this one so it can be put in the machine, and we can sew another 1/4 inch seam allowance on this side. Once you're all finished sewing your seams, we're going to open them up and give them a nice press and make sure everything's laying nice and flat before we do the next part. After we finish the top, it's time to do what we call the quilt sandwich. This is where we compile all the pieces of the quilt to make it complete. So the quilt sandwich is made out of 3 different pieces. You have the back, and then you have extra batting, and then the top of the quilt. So the first layer is the back, and we're going to start with that. When you cut your back, you want to make sure that it is several inches bigger than the quilt top. This is to accommodate for shifting and pulling when we do all the stitching in the ditch. And we're going to spread that out and get it prepared so that we can put the second layer on, which is going to be the extra layer of batting. All right, so for batting, we recommend it is also a little bit bigger than the top of your quilt, at least an inch or so bigger on all sides. So we're going to lay that out next. Something that you can remember is that if your batting isn't the correct size, you can always piece it together. Okay, so for all of your quilts, we recommend anything that's larger than a 22 by 22 to have that extra layer of batting. So we're going to spread that out on top of our back, and then we're going to take a spray adhesive. And we're going to just give it a little shake, and we're going to do this in sections. We're going to pull back the first corner here, and then we're going to make sure it's laying nice and flat, and we're going to give it a spray. And we're going to take our batting and bring it back over, and we're going to smooth it out. And then what we'll do is we'll slowly move our way through the whole quilt, spraying little sections until it's all stuck down nice and taut. All right, so after you get the back and the batting stuck down, we're also going to stick down the front. And this we're going to do with the same spray, just spray it on. And then take it and smooth it nice and flat. Now it does help to do this in a wide open space where you have plenty of room to lay it out nice and flat. As I mentioned before, sometimes your batting isn't the correct size, and sometimes you need to also piece together your back fabric. The back fabric, you'll make a simple seam, but your batting, we're going to put them together and we're going to zigzag stitch right along the seam lines, and I like to call it Frankensteining your batting just because it's kind of fun. So we're going to take our batting and we're going to put it side by side, and we're going to just give it a quick zigzag stitch to join it together. And we want to line up that seam line right at the center of your foot. So we're going to go ahead and stitch a zigzag. All right, it ends up looking just like this. Simple, just a nice join, and because it's a zigzag, I think it looks like Frankenstein. So that's how you join your batting together. So the next step is to stitch in the ditch. What that means is we're going to stitch around each of these blocks right here in the seam line so that the back and the batting and the front are all joined together. The best way to do that is to start in the very center of your quilt and work your way out. And it's a good idea to kind of road map it. What we don't want to do is go around one block 6 times and then another block once. So it's a good thing to start right in the center and then work your way out to the ends of your quilt. Where my quilt has 4 rows, I don't have a designated center block. So I can start with either of these that are in the middle of the quilt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the X here on the quilt, and then I'm going to go around the square here, and then I'm going to move to the next block and just work my way out. If you happen to have a stitch in the ditch foot, that makes this a lot easier, but you can do it with a regular foot as long as you have a center mark so that you have something to look at to make sure you're getting right in the ditch. We do recommend that you use the same color thread that you use for your quilting, or to go ahead and use invisible thread. Either work fine. Where this is a bigger quilt, it's a little bit difficult to get all of that fabric into the machine. So we're going to take our excess fabric and we're going to roll it so that it is kind of a nice little cinnamon roll there. And we're going to take our slap bands. We're going to slap it so that it can hold that quilt out of our way. You can go ahead and use as many as you want. I happen to have 2 right now, but you can slap as many help hold your quilt out of the way. So this is because it's going to be in here in the throat of my machine. So I'm going to take it and slide the skinny part under the foot and put the excess fabric here into the throat of the machine. And get my block centered so I can start stitching in the ditch. Ready, guys? So I'm going to pull my block toward me since I stitch forward, and I'm going to line everything up right here in this center seam line. So I'm going to put my foot down And then I'm going to lower my needle, and what I'm looking for is that everything is lining up, and I don't want to start stitching until I see my needle in the right place. So once everything's lined up and your needle is where you want it to be, look at your center line on your foot right here and make sure that it's following along with your seam line. And go slow. This is not something that has to be done quickly. So let's get started. So if you can see, I'm going just really nice and easy. And what I'm doing is while I'm stitching, I have a hand on the big cinnamon roll of my quilt and another hand on the outside, and I'm just easing it along at the same time. Okay, when you get close to the other end, we don't want to go into our sashing. So we're going to go really slow and make sure we stop right in the ditch if possible. Sometimes I like to just guide the needle by twisting it for that final stitch. Okay, so when I get to the end, I'm going to lift my needle out, make sure that it's clipped. Then I'm going to lift the presser foot, and I have to rotate my quilt all the way around. And what we're going for is this opposite line of that X. And you might have a little bit of extra bulk, but that's okay. It'll kind of work itself in. And again, we're going to line up that foot, and then we're going to line up the needle, make sure everything is lined up before we take a single stitch. Okay, and now we get to do the next one. Remember, if you have a lot of bulk in here, that keeps moving along. Slow down as you get to the corner. And now this time, since we have done both of the inner seams, we can leave the needle where it is, lift up our presser foot, rotate our quilt so that it saves our spot. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch around the square. So we're going to get everything situated, lower our foot, make sure our fabric are on either side of that center line, and then continue stitching. Just make sure you're moving the quilt with you. It's a little bit heavy now, so you gotta help it along. Okay, as you get close to the corner, don't go too quick. And then, again, leave your needle in, lift your foot, and turn the corner. Get everything situated again, and then continue stitching this line. Okay, now we started in the middle of this last edge, so we're only going to stitch right to where we started. So we're going to turn it one final time. Line it up and then give it a stitch. Okay, and just like that, we've stitched around one of our blocks. So the thing to remember is don't forget to do all of the little cornerstones. And so stitch your blocks and your cornerstones. That'll get the top and bottoms of these as well. And you'll end up stitching around every piece of your quilt. You know what's exciting? After you've stitched in the ditch and you've put all your quilt sandwich together, it is time to bind, which I actually quite enjoy. So I'm going to show you how to cut binding. What we're going to do is we're going to line up our fabric with the edge of our cutting board. And then we're going to take a ruler and we're going to cut our binding 2.5 inches wide. So we're going to line that up here. And we're going to cut that. And we're doing this with the width of fabric. So we're going to go ahead and set that aside. And if you have questions about binding, there's some really great instructions in the General Resource Guide. This is just a quick peek at them, but they really go through step by step on how to bind. So that's available there. But I'm going to stitch it with you. So after you have your binding cut, we're going to what's called miter them together. Why we need to do that is we need one really long strip. I've already mitered quite a few strips together for this quilt, and I'm going to do the last one with you. So I'm going to scooch over here to the sewing machine. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to take one binding strip and lay it vertically, and the other and lay it horizontally. And you got to do this on the same side continuously so that you don't have seams flip-flopping. They got to be on the same side the whole time. And then after they are on top of each other like this, we're going to twist this and we're going to put it in the machine. And what we're going to do is we're going to stitch a diagonal stitch line just right here. And we're connecting from where this part is to where this is. So we're going to line that up. We're going to stitch just a straight stitch. Straight across. All right. And what we have done here is we have a nice seam right here. And we're going to take our scissors. We're going to open this up so you can see that it made a nice continuous line. And we're going to trim off most of that fabric, leaving just about 1/4 inch of the fabric. And that way we have a nice continuous line. So what needs to happen next is we need to do some ironing. So I'm going to bring up my iron and my mat, and I'm going to show you how to iron this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fabric and we're going to turn it wrong sides together. You know it's the wrong side if it's the side that your seam is going to be visible with the raw edges. We're going to just flatten that out. I like to give it a little bit of water to help me crease it good. And we're going to take our iron and we're going to just press it nice and flat. So it's just folding it in half and then pressing it well. Okay, and then we're going to carry on and do that along the whole strip. After we've finished stitching in the ditch, it's time to prepare our quilt for the binding. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a ruler, and the ruler is obviously a lot shorter than my quilt, so we're going to be cutting in sections. So we'll take it and set it right against the edge of our front of our quilt, and take our rotary cutter, and we're going to press down on that ruler so it doesn't slide, and we're just going to cut nice and close, and then we're going to shift. We'll just pull the quilt towards us, line everything back up again, and then we'll cut again. Okay, so the best part about binding, it is the finishing part of the quilt. So what I've done is I've taken the binding just on the end and I have looped it over several inches just so I know to save that at the end, and I don't want to stitch that part so I can have it to fold later. So I'm just going to clip those in place like that, and then I've clipped another one here on the end and then right here on the corner. This way I'm making sure that I stop close to my corner, and I'm going to show you how to miter the corner in a second. Alright, so now we're going to take our quilt and we're going to twist it around. We're going to go ahead and fold some of it over just so that it's not falling off our table here. There we go. Alright, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing my binding on just after this folded fabric. So I'm going to put it about there, and I'm going to do about a 1/4 inch, a scant 1/4 inch, and we're going to stitch this on. It'll be fine. So I like to have clips just to help me hold it a little bit, and then I move them out of the way when I get close. And I'm going to just keep smoothing my fabric. And then remember, in the general resource guide, it has more information on the binding. We're going to hold this nice and taut against that corner. And we're going to sew to about a 1/4 inch to the end. And then we're going to stop and we're going to twist our fabric so that we can go at a 45-degree angle off that corner. You stitch along here, get to that 1/4 inch, and then you do that 45-degree angle just like that, and it's hitting right on the corner. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fold our seam. So we're going to take our binding and we're going to pull it against where we are right here on those stitch lines. So we're pulling it against that 45-degree and making sure it's nice and taut, and you're kind of folding a nice triangle here. Then you're going to take it and pull it straight back down. And what we're trying to do is line up this fold with this line here. And I'm going to clip it in place just on this corner so that it stays folded just like that. And then I'm going to take my quilt and I'm going to twist it. And then I'm going to start sewing again, just a little bit in from the seam. Again, we want to stay somewhere around that 1/4 inch. So I'm not going to start on the very end. I'm going to start in a little bit, do a tiny back stitch just to secure my stitching, and then I'm going to again pull my binding nice and flat and then carry on stitching. And that is a mitered corner. So now that we have stitched our binding all the way around the quilt, it's time to miter the last seam together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take both ends of our binding and we're going to fold it and have them butt up against each other. And then we're going to take a pair of scissors and we're going to just slip it in on this side and cut the binding right there. I'm going to remove those clips. Then we're going to take this binding, and since this is 2.5 inches, it becomes a great ruler. So all we have to do is lay it against this side, and then we can cut this right at 2.5 inches. And we can just get rid of the rest of the fabric there. And then just because often it needs a little bit of a shortening on this side, we're going to trim the tiniest bit of fabric, just a smidge, so that way it's going to lay nice and flat and not have excess. So then we're going to take our binding and we're going to bring this end down and we're going to open it up and this end over, and we're going to lay it right on top of the other, and we're going to clip this in place so that we can miter this last seam. So we're going to put a clip here and here, and then we're going to take it back to the machine and sew a diagonal stitch. So what we're going to do is we're going to just fold our quilt in half, and that leaves a lot of extra space over here for us to miter this seam. We already know that it is situated the way we want it to be. So we're going to go ahead and just line it up here in the machine. Make sure our fabric is sitting straight. So So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch right here. We're just connecting this corner with the other corner that's under the pressure foot. So we're going to line it up, and then we're going to stitch away. Okay, and then we always double check our binding before we cut anything, because the last thing we want to do is cut it and then it's not quite right. So we're going to reopen our quilt, and we're going to lay the binding nice and flat and make sure there's not a bunch of excess. And once we like it, we can go over here and trim off the extra fabric, just leaving about a 1/4 inch. And then we're going to finish stitching our binding down, and we'll have it all attached. And then we can just stitch. After all the binding is attached, we're going to take it and we're going to fold it over to the back side, and we're going to take about the same amount. Make sure that there's enough fabric here and there, and then we're going to take a needle and thread and we're going to hand bind this. Now we're choosing to hand bind this because it's not one of those quilts that's going to be on the back of a couch or on somebody's bed. When it's not going to be used a ton, then we can hand bind it. So we're going to take our needle and thread and we're going to just pop it in here. I've already knotted the end, and I do have this double knotted. And then we're going to take just a teeny bit of the binding, and then we're going to grab a little bit of the quilt, and we're going to continue doing any kind of blind stitch that you prefer all the way around. So then we're going to go back in and then grab a teeny bit of the quilt, and we're going to pull that through. And we're going to do this all the way around the quilt until we have it all finished. Just like this. And it's going to look gorgeous. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a lot too. I am so excited to see your quilts. And if you are missing any of the month's blocks from the first year of Perfectly Pieced, the designs are available in the MeTime store at metimedelivered.com. We had such a fun year stitching with you, and we are so excited to get started with year 2 of Perfectly Pieced. Be sure to like and subscribe and follow for more content. Now, go enjoy some well-deserved me time.